Thank you everyone for joining. Just wanted to say that I'm very proud that Radical Exchange is able to host this seminar today. This I think this paper is really making a point that is going to be of increasing importance over the next few years. So I'm very happy to see it out there and grateful that so many people want to learn more about it and discuss it. The authors are pointing out the fact that even though for many years I think rightly been focused on this issue of how to sort of prove the humanity of people who are interacting on digital networks, that's actually sort of not all we need to know. There are very interesting and important ways in which other things can go wrong, in which deeper problems can emerge, even when we are able to verify that, in some sense, there's a human on the other end of the line. So I will pass it over to Paula to get us started on the conversation. But yeah, without further ado, here's Puja, Paula, and Mikhail, and thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. So I want to get us started by situating this investigation that we had on this paper within a series of questions that we are all asking ourselves as generative AI technology emerges. So there are some questions which are about the governance of these systems. How can we make sure that we, the public who are impacted by this technology, have a voice in making decisions about how this technology is developed? Then there are questions about economic distribution. So is AI going to take our jobs, essentially? And in a scenario where many jobs are automated away, is universal basic income an interesting solution looking forward? And then there are questions about authenticity of information. So how can we trust the information that we encounter online? Is it real or not? And this question is very important because authenticity of information is essential for both well-functioning political systems like democracies and well-functioning markets. So many of these questions have motivated the creation of these new kinds of protocols called proof of personhood, and we might be referring to them as POP in this presentation. And the goal of these protocols, if you're not familiar with them yet, is to make sure that each person in the real world has a unique representation online, one-to-one. So there are two major challenges to achieving that. One is that we want to make sure that these systems are AI resistant. So AI can now mimic our voices and our appearance and can write like us. So we want to make sure that a proof of personhood protocol can distinguish between AI and real human beings. And another is that once it does that, which is not at all trivial to achieve, then we want to make sure that people can't register twice. So all that we want to know in a proof of personhood protocol is that people are not AI and that they haven't registered twice. We're not capturing any information about the identity of the participants in these systems. And if you have a registry like that, then it opens up a lot of different possibilities, like you can do online votes. So for example, if we were to do a vote on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, it would have very low legitimacy because people can create these fake identities in these systems. But if you had a registry like that, you could have governance systems with high legitimacy. And so this has been touted as a way to potentially facilitate governance for AI models. And then this would also facilitate the distribution of universal basic income type of system where you could be sure that each person would only get their rightful amount of rewards and not get it twice or more times. And today what we want to do is to offer a critique of this model, which is looking at one of the first personhood systems to achieve this goal successfully. And this protocol is called IDENA Network. And we're very honored to have the founder of the IDENA Network, Mikhail, with us today. And this is quite rare for a protocol founder to be coming forward and being very transparent about some of the shortcomings of a protocol that they created. So we're very grateful for Mikhail's support and collaboration in this paper and for being with us today. And I'll hand it over to Mikhail in a minute to walk us through how IDENA works. But I just want to say a couple of things about why we chose to look into IDENA. The first is that it's a very early proof of personhood protocol. It's a blockchain-based protocol that achieved the ability to have an endogenous network of validators with a one-person, one-vote consensus. So it was an actually democratic blockchain based protocol, which is quite rare and a very difficult thing to achieve. And so it filtered bots, it validated humans through a very sophisticated protocol for doing that, for verifying personhood. And then it also was able to have an interesting solution against account trading. So the system worked so well that people couldn't really find ways to defraud it. And through the protocol, directly through the protocol. And so they started to sell their accounts in a black market. And then there's an interesting new system that IDENA developed to stymie that. And this is going to be the topic of a different paper. We're not going to go too deep into this today, but I just wanted to elevate how important is what IDENA has been able to achieve so far. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mikhail, who is going to walk us through how IDENA works and what motivated him and his colleagues to start this protocol.
Thanks, Paula. Before I start, I would like first to stress that IDENA was not like created to be an identity solution, but actually we considered some identity protocols to integrate into the IDENA blockchain at the beginning. So our motivation was actually to create alternative to proof of stake systems and address their challenges of centralization associated with token voting. And these are the problems actually inherent in capital, which has heavy-tailed Pareto distribution. And now we can see that in proof of stake networks, large staking pools benefit from the economies of scale, which I think is inevitable. And as a result, solo miners are vanishing and giving way to oligopoly. So in contrast, we aimed to build a decentralized network of nodes separated by individuals. And the goal was actually to have an excessive number of nodes facilitating sharding and to solve simply a technical problem of blockchain scalability. And in such network, every node was intended to be operated by unique human with unique verified account. So various proof of person protocols establish uniqueness in different ways, and unlike WorldCoin and other protocols which employ biometric data, IDENA relies on simultaneous cognitive tests, so-called validation ceremonies, which happen every few weeks synchronously for all participants. So the idea is based like the uniqueness is proven by the fact that you cannot be in multiple places in the same time. And by solving the flip test, you actually prove that you are not bot. And the flip test is a test based on the user-generated story that makes sense in one configuration, but it's meaningless in another. So for example, you can see on the left sequence tells us a coherent story about beasting, whereas the causality on the right side makes no sense. So what happened? IDENA launched in 2019 and accounts steadily increased. But as the network grew, on-chain data began to show us like some kind of suspicious patterns of transactions sending rewards from many accounts to the same wallets. And this kind of coordinated one-way transfers at the same time, to the same wallet implied some sort of automation which would require third-party access to participants' private keys. So either these participants had unwittingly ceded their private keys to third party, or they just never had them. By December 2020, one of the users contacted us and admitted to running a human farm, or like a pool of humans. So in fact, the high information operators pay low information participants, like puppets, to periodically perform validation ceremonies and verify their uniqueness in exchange for controlling their accounts and their private keys. So these puppies were either unaware of their private keys, or they knew their private keys, but they were unaware of the significance of these private keys within the protocol. So the puppeteering was not a traditional Sybil attack, where usually malicious actors could fake multiple Sybil accounts, typically using some algorithmic bots, but instead, as the protocol had filtered bots and successfully authenticated flesh and blood humans, the puppeteering was de facto Sybil attack of humans acting like programmable bots. So at best, puppeteers extracted some amount of delta between like UBI paid by the protocol and workers' wages, and at worst, they could just take all the rewards of the puppet accounts. But what the picture was like so black and white, actually pool operators also claimed that some of like awakened puppets were coming back. So they were offering a service to consensual participants and being remunerated for that. So earning rewards on IDINA presented a number of hassles. So like you need to run a node, you need to exchange the rewards into local currency, and the pool operators could coordinate these tasks better than participants on their own. So in short, it could be kind of a cooperation and like pools providing the service to some of the participants. So reality that there are like two extreme possibilities and the spectrum in between, and the same transaction pattern with one-way transfers at the same time to the same wallet can indicate both puppeteering or voluntary cooperation.
Hi, Misha, sorry to interrupt you. Your slides are not switching forward.
Oops. Can you see it?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so this is the spectrum, and what's important that actually both extremes different, not how they look like on chain, but how they like, but in the distribution of the information and control off chain. So for instance, in puppeteering, operators have more control and more information. They know how the protocol works. They control the private keys, and they capitalize their asymmetry of control in exchange for minimum wages and like maximally extracting to their own advantage. In contrast, cooperation has greater symmetry in information control, and participants may know how the protocol works and control their keys, but nonetheless, they find it mutually beneficial to pool resources and delegate control, including their private keys, to operator for greater rewards with economies of scale, but holding operators accountable off-chain. Oops. Can you see it? All right. So despite aiming to establish transparent network of individuals with unique accounts, the protocol collapsed into hidden groups and subnetworks. And these groups, whether autocratic or democratic, were competing to control over fixed economic pie. In May 2021, rather than fight pools, IDINA community agreed to make a hard fork and bring pools out of unquantified shadows using delegation. And the on-chain delegation gave pools an economic incentives. So now pooled accounts could earn mining rewards using only one node instead of like running multiple nodes for every account. But what's more important is that now pool operators could handle operational hassles and earn accounts rewards without even needing to know the participants' private keys. And providing economic incentives, the delegation succeeded in making pools transparent. So you can see the green area shows the network pre-delegation when accounts just couldn't be differentiated, even though they were controlled by the same pool operator.
Misha, you need to move forward in your slides.
Oops. Is it updated? All right. I don't know what's happening. But, so yeah, so as you see on the chart, after delegation, when the protocol could measure the size of the pools. And as the network grew, the growth was notably among large pools, which are like red, while solo accounts, which are blue, outlined, constituting smaller and smaller proportion of the network up until the peak of the puppeteering crisis in May 2022. All right, hope it's updated. So the percentage of the solo accounts in blue shrunk from 62% to 27% of the network. And large pools had reverse trend, ballooning from 22% to 61% of the network. Large pools had also like captured a larger share of rewards from the fixed economic pie, dumping Adina coin price and squeezing rewards from solo accounts. So as the number of single node pools increased, the nodes as a percentage of the network in turn significantly dropped, leading to loss of throughput and security. So the purpose of delegation was to make coordinated pools visible and enable pool operators handle operational hassles for participants, like running the nodes and so on, like without needing to know their private keys. But oddly, large pools continue to show the signs of third-party key access and automated simultaneous or sequential transactions like delegations, account terminations, or funneling rewards earned before delegation, or rewards unlocked after termination of accounts. And looking at these factors, we examined like 31 top pools that had ever been delegated to more than 100 accounts in the Adina protocol history. And all these 31 top pools showed signs of third-party key access. And moreover, some of the pools had financial ties, and if we treat them as the same entity or subnetworks, then these 31 pools were in fact only 23 entities. So the puppeteering crisis reached its peak in May 2022, and there were only 23 entities representing less than 1% of the distinct entities, controlling at least 40% of accounts, almost half of the protocol rewards. So this was something that actually prompted us to change the model of the protocol from proof of personhood to so-called sublinear identity staking, which is the combination of proof of stake and proof of personhood. And this will be the topic of our next paper titled Between 0 and 1. Now I would like to hand over to Puja.
Thanks.
To present.
Okay, so to a lot of you, there's damning statistic about third-party key access that Misha showed in the last slide would just be straight up prima facie evidence for puppeteering. And if you're in Web3, the common refrain is not your keys, not your control, not your keys, not your coins, and so on. But we wanted to take a little bit more of a nuanced perspective and acknowledge that third-party key access or delegation, that actually could be a voluntary kind of custody as a service choice by someone who actually has high information. But this is presuming that they could hold their operators accountable off-chain. And in this scenario, it wouldn't be puppeteering, right? And to this higher standard, though, to address that argument, we argue that actually there was an improbable lack of marketing and disputes, hence the silent strings. There was an improbable lack of marketing and disputes that would otherwise accompany an off-chain accountable relationship. And this silence was more indicative of puppeteering than an accountable principal-agent relationship. And then there was other corroborating facts that were consistent with this story. The known jurisdictions of the 3 largest pools were weak in rule of law: Russia, Egypt, and Indonesia. And actually, Misha, can you go back like 2 slides? Because that was not shown. Yeah. So you can see here that there's actually, looking at the top 100 pools, and this constitutes almost half the network. There's 3 gigantic large pools, and the blue, red, and yellow. And those pools were all in these low rule, weak rule of law jurisdictions. And at the same time, we saw solo accounts and family pools which have less than 15 accounts, flatlining, while these gigantic large pools with weak social ties were blooming. And you can see that in this chart as they're peaking over time, right? And then, of course, we had these conversations with the human pool operators themselves, or Misha did, not we, who controlled, at least 14% of the accounts, confirming that they were simply paying participants to perform these ceremonies. And then, of course, there was the damning statistic in that next slide, Misha, where the top 3 networks controlled almost, a fifth of the network accounts, and having this meteoric rise and fall, also consistent with puppeteering. So by, the totality of these facts, we could conclude that this intended model of one person, one vote had collapsed into these puppeteered subnetworks. Can you go to the previous slide, Misha? And yet this analysis was cursory, right? It excluded actually 84 large pools that held between 15 and 100 counts. And it also excluded 411 family pools. And this, in total, this is actually 95% of the pools in the network, right? So the statistics here could only get worse and not better. So I want to talk about takeaways. And I think the first takeaway in systems and design thinking is, by giving humans economic incentives to periodically differentiate themselves from bots, even as low as $2 or $14 every few weeks, which is what IDENA gave, they also gave more informed, resourceful humans financial incentives to control and puppeteer less informed humans like bots, right? And those humans were actually happy to do that for a paycheck. And this takes us to takeaway number 2, next slide. Even when participants traded their time for this paycheck from more resourceful humans, they transformed a system that was intended to be one person, one vote into essentially one token, one vote, where those with more resources, plutocrats and puppeteers, gain outsized influence, and they undermine the point of the experiment, right? Which takes us to takeaway 3. These economies of scale for the more resourceful to exploit is common to all global protocols. It's not just unique to IDENA. And other protocols will validate humans in different ways. For example, WorldCoin uses biometric scans. But just because participants don't have to run a node or do periodic cognitive tests like they did in IDENA doesn't mean that they don't have hassles. They just have a different set of hassles, which intermediaries and operators will be happy to step up and perform. And this is also takeaway number 4. These exploits might not always manifest as quote unquote puppeteering, but can surface as a more special case of account trading. IDENA, as Misha mentioned, figured out how to actually stop account trading through this novel mechanism called identity staking. But other protocols, notably, for example, like WorldCoin, they also had this problem of account trading, and that was documented in several articles, not by WorldCoin, but by journalists. And so account trading in these protocols shouldn't actually be treated as this evidence of advanced mechanisms or protections. To the contrary, account trading might actually signal a lack of them and may be a precursor to this deeper problem of puppeteering. Which takes us to point 5, takeaway 5. The challenge of filtering humans from bots, controlling accounts, can actually be separated from this broader informational challenge. So proof of personhood seeks to differentiate humans from bots, but not humans from their biases. And as IDENA demonstrated, when given incentives to differentiate themselves from bots, and those incentives are financial, humans also have incentives to align, control, and puppeteer other humans as if they were bots, right, to amplify their biases. And it's actually the biases or the problem of faction that we care about in systems of checks and balances and democratic governance, right? So at the start of this conversation, Paula mentioned that, well, these systems at least help us differentiate us from humans and bots, then that's the ambition. But also, as you know, we're increasingly integrating with technology in different ways and different degrees. And so this informational challenge becomes more acute as we further integrate biologically, even, for example, with neural interfaces. And this distinction between filtering humans from bots and humans acting like bots, or de facto and de jure Sybil resistance, this distinction is actually going to blur more, and if not collapse, revealing the more foundational challenge than establishing biological uniqueness, which is just establishing the informational uniqueness of participants, or the extent to which they cluster with the same interests and biases. Which takes us to takeaway 6. This is on the next slide. This is not a technical problem. This is actually a social problem. And de facto Sybils, or humans acting like bots, really are the natural abjects of colluders or puppeteers. So by extension, de facto Sybil resistance is actually a mirror or co-implicated challenge to collusion resistance. And neither of these problems can be solved independently, but they actually have to be solved simultaneously, which takes us to the last takeaway, which is that thwarting on-chain vote buying, and this is like there's a lot of investment and development among academics towards things like receipt freeness and things in like proofs of complete knowledge. That actually doesn't solve for this off-chain vote buying into meat space, and it actually may encourage it as a low-cost alternative. So going back to how IDENA undermined account trading with identity staking, the next best alternative for vote buying became through off-chain puppeteering mechanisms, or simply buying participants' time if they can't buy their accounts. So when on-chain vote buying, for example, in trusted execution environments becomes costly, we can expect the resourceful to simply move off-chain. So next slide. The IDENA experiment really underscores the importance of thinking in terms of incentives and systems and interacting systems, and most importantly, acknowledging the ties and social ties that arise from both, talking in politics and trading in markets. And this is just one paper in a series. As Misha mentioned in the next one, we're going to examine more deeply this relationship between establishing unique accounts and proof of stake in this paper about sublinear identity staking called Between 0 and 1. And then after that, I will explore social identity more. So I think that's it. We have about half an hour for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was terrific. I guess I'll get started with one question, and then I'll kind of take the stack and try to direct traffic as others ask questions. But one thing I'd like to start off with is this paper made me think a lot about the implications of AI and of just sort of and of like using AI in social settings. So for example, probably many of us have already experienced this kind of this feeling of like you're interacting with another human being, you're interacting with another human being, but you're suspecting that they're composing their writing to you using ChatGPT, right? That just kind of points, I think, to that sort of sensation that someone is not behaving quite like a human being, kind of resonates with this idea that people are acting like bots in the sense of a cryptographic network, the way that you're describing. And I wonder if you have thoughts about that, and about the sort of some of the broader implications of the point you're making.
So yeah, I think and so there are ways in which like technology can help us. There's a couple angles to this. Kind of ironically, the more we have AI models that are hoovered up from global data sets, the nuance and complexity of language kind of I don't want to say it reverts to some kind of mean, but it kind of it becomes less nuanced. And, you know, there's different, when you go to, so for example, you go to, I'm from the United States, you go to different parts of the United States, people speak English in different ways with like different accents. And that gives you a sense of context, right? But you also do that in writing, and that also gives you a sense of context. And with these global protocols, when you just hoover up data from everywhere, then you kind of get the sense you're like, okay, they're using language in this way that feels like I'm talking to ChatGPT. And one of the challenges and one of the things that I am more focused on is actually getting expressing identity, first of all, as like a constellation of your memberships to different groups. But when you do that, you also empower groups to form maybe their own and govern their own LLMs that capture the richness of their context and the nuance of their language. And when you look at it, say an account, you can kind of judge when it's talking to you, not just by what you see in an email, but the kind of context of that person to the extent they reveal what groups they share, you know, are part of, that you are part of as well. And that gives a richness of context, preserves a richness of context and contextual integrity, but also preserves the richness of language. And so, you know, in that scenario, AI can actually help us keep language nuanced and, you know, the richness of multiple meanings of words in different contexts. But also, if you kind of take this global approach, it completely erases that. So there's a way in which it can really augment it, and there's a way in which it can diminish it. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has anything else to say on that. And Paula, if you want to jump in. But does that answer your question, Matt? Do I address that?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. So I'd love to open the floor, you know, to other questions now. Please, if you can, you know, use the little hand raise button, and I'll sort of keep track of the stack, or just unmute and oh yeah, Grace, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you were saying about thinking of identity as your participation in a bunch of groups. And in some ways, Gitcoin Passport sort of does that by trying to, you know, give multiple signals that you're a person. But how are you thinking about that? Are you thinking about that as people having multiple non-transferable tokens? Like, what are you envisioning? Because I think that's right. Like, if you're a long-term member of enough groups, you're probably actually a person. So yeah, I want to hear more about that idea.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like a philosophical level, and then there's like a computational point. So on like the philosophical level, you can think of individuals just being an amalgamation of all the different conversations you've had with different people on a one-on-one basis and groups, and we're born into social contexts, into families and nested geographic environments that are part of nation states and so on. And so, you know, I'm in a lot of ways an amalgamation of the many groups that I've interacted with over time, right? And you can also think the other way, the flip side around, which is that groups are a constellation of all the unique individuals that compose them, right? And so you can look at the network in like two different ways. And yeah, I think there are interesting steps and experiments to do this. And Gitcoin Passport is one example. But I think the key is, it's not just I have a wallet and I want to populate it with as many groups, but you also want to, you know, there's a web of trust aspect to this, where it's not, you don't just care that I'm part of the American Bar Association, you know, or like lived in New York or whatever, right? There's some of these groups that have more relevance and credibility to you, right? That like maybe I'm part of RadicalxChange. And so representing that, enabling people to acknowledge also the sort of different levels of trust with these groups, I think is important. And making these groups credible with enough like thickness and communication. And so the experiments I think in Web3 are interesting, but they also these groups are relatively thin. And they're thin also because they precisely are operating on this like global scale. And the reality is we're actually like kind of local creatures, and we care about what's in our immediate environment. And, digital membership into digital groups is something that's important to be represented, but it's definitely not the full story, and it's certainly not the most relevant story. Misha, I don't know if you want to say something.
Yeah, I would also add like regarding these Gitcoin passport stamps, they are not related to each other, like they're not linked to each other, right? Which means that every single stamp is a kind of a subject of Sybil attack, right? So they kind of increase your identity score on the Gitcoin passport, but they just being played and gamed, right, by the Sybil attackers. Because actually, the problem of this Gitcoin passport is used for funding, right, project funding, and there is a strong economic incentive that just fuels the Sybil attack. So it's something that actually let puppeteers, to buy accounts, and then kind of, so they can spend the money that they earn on these Gitcoin funding rounds.
And you've seen that, Misha, right? For example, because IDENA became some way to actually accumulate a greater identity score, right, on Gitcoin. Maybe you want to talk about
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting because we actually shifted the model from like a UBI kind of distribution to more like a stake distribution. So it's like identity stake as a function of like share of your reward in the protocol, and it should have been like mitigated the puppeteering problem, but we still see this kind of puppeteering activity because they're actually these accounts are used on the Gitcoin passport, so we have this kind of externalities, for IDENA. So it's kind of this something that like a pays, from the Gitcoin passports to these puppeteers, to make them creating accounts on IDENA as well.
So let me actually like say that again, because I think that's a profound point. Like, so IDENA made steps to actually flesh out puppeteering, which is like this next paper, which by acknowledging the role of economic stake, and accounts that have economic stake, and this other system change in Gitcoin actually kind of undid that because it had its own set of incentives that were suddenly rewarding IDENA accounts. And so suddenly the puppeteers had a new source of revenue, not from IDENA, but from Gitcoin. That's right.
Yeah, it's interesting because we cannot do anything about that, right? Like, because Gitcoin is a kind of separate system that actually utilizes IDENA's identity. And initially, we actually offered them to use the stake, the size of the stake as a different kinds of stamps that increases your score. So it's to make it like also a function of stake. But now they kind of remove that stamps and just they say, okay, if you're validated on IDENA, then you get some score, and it becomes immediately becomes a subject of Sybil attack, right?
I have a response to Matt's original question, if I may. There's one aspect of that sort of confusion. So Matt was talking about how we can interact with someone online and we are not sure if that person really authored the message or if it was written by an AI. But I think that there's another experience that we have all felt more often, and that has more important, more well-acknowledged implications for our societies, which is that sometimes we, even before AI, we would speak to people. I have certainly felt like that, where I spoke to someone and I felt like they were replicating views that were elevated through social media algorithms. So it was the feeling of like I'm just talking to this awful corner of Twitter right now and not a human being. And I think that these identity protocols, the hope is that eventually, as they continue developing and elaborating, they will serve as the base on top of which many different applications can be created. And what we want ultimately is to have a healthier, more functional internet. And so by looking at protocols that are not necessarily universal, and universal protocols might be needed, but by combining them with other protocols that preserve context, I think that the ability to have more diversity of thought in society also hopefully can get more preserved. So this is, I think, one of the motivations for wanting to look for different paradigms, because right now the current paradigm is one in which bots or algorithms are already prevailing and shaping how we interact with each other. So this, I just wanted to position this sort of quest for finding good ways for verifying identity within this sort of larger challenge of finding good ways to interact with each other and create communities online, or represent communities online.
Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for the paper. They're really deep and interesting. Looking forward for the next one. I liked, in the paper, I liked, and in your work, I liked the idea of collaborating with malicious ones, with the hackers. And I'm curious, have you tried to negotiate with them about selling their pools to you for some amount of money? To know, basically to know the price at which they will be willing to do that, and thus the price of rebuilding such pool again. Have you tried that?
No, we never tried that, actually. Might be interesting idea, but well, as far as I understand, the purpose is like to understand their costs, right? What we actually
yeah,
know about
the cost of forgery. Yeah.
Once we kind of shifted to the subliminal identity staking model, then they kind of shrunk, right? Like, so we don't see them like this large, like Russian or Indonesian pools. They're not there anymore, but some other kind of appeared because of the Bitcoin incentives. It's a good question. But we try to estimate like what is the kind of average wages in different countries, and this kind of can give us like, you know, some estimation of their costs. But it's an interesting question. Yeah. No, we didn't.
Even if you did that, though, you're encouraging them, right, to accumulate more accounts, right? Then you're actually just adding fuel to the fire. So I think
no, actually, I don't think so. You don't need even wages here. You're just estimating the efforts of the puppeteer. It may be very low because they have their network of people. They will just like rebuilding. You are just learning the cost of building infrastructure again, or like just bringing this their known human network back online again. So this shouldn't be a very high cost.
But I assume that as these systems become stable and interact with other systems, for example, like we were saying about Gitcoin, then the price inevitably increases. So there's a limit to this solution.
Actually, I don't think that also implies here.
So another way to think about it is, so in this paper, we talked about puppeteering, right? And that's how we framed it. And there was a lot of evidence that suggested it was more of kind of, you know, resourceful people who kind of are taking advantage literally of like kids or people who just don't even know what they're trading for and they don't know the significance. But there's also there are some part, right? There are family pools, there are other pools where there's just economies of scale to coordination. And anytime you have like a global protocol for something, right, there's going to be, whether it's like staking pools or any, any global protocol where there's economic incentives, there's always going to be economies of scale to coordination. And that's not even malicious, right? That's like, that's just people organizing to make their lives more convenient and reimbursing somebody. And so like, over time, say this did become ubiquitous, right? And say like we all it ends up becoming the Schelling point, some global protocol, say it's like WorldCoin, for example, right? Like the point isn't that this is malicious or evil, right? The point is you don't end up, there's these initial stated ambitions of this is going to be egalitarian, this is going to be democratic, this is going to be one person, one vote. No, what you end up with is actually oligopolistic market structure, right? And you end up with like a handful of firms, and they kind of like, have their economies of scale and they're servicing their customers, but it's no longer this like, let's like just be, it's not a democratic game. Now we have to negotiate with these kind of oligopolies in this other, and they're nested within many other systems. Gitcoin's out of the picture at this point, right? It's essentially like governments and other actors that are relying on this universal coordination substrate. But it's not, the point is that it's not this like democratic game anymore. It's an oligopolistic one. And how do you actually, when we're here because we're interested in pluralism, plurality, and in building decentralized systems, right? And the kind of starting premise of all of this is that we can do something better than oligopoly, and we can push power down to not necessarily individuals, because individuals versus a nation state or versus a global protocol, they have no bargaining power, but we can push power down to communities, and communities and network with other communities have much more significant not only significant bargaining power, but can actually truly make these systems more democratic and achieve what we want by democratic governance, which is surfacing a spectrum of goods beyond private, but like also to public goods and provisioning that. And, so that's just sort of the broader point. It's not sort of like evil or maliciousness. It's more like, look, we want to have some certain configuration of power and decentralized power because this is good for freedom. This is good for prosperity. This is good for wealth generation. Nobody wants to live under monopoly. How do we do that? Definitely.
So anyway, that was more like a brainstorm request. If anyone's interested, we can brainstorm this idea. Thank you.
I'd like to ask your thoughts on where this space is going. So what do you see in the future of identity verification or sort of decentralized systems that are trying to identify real human participants? What do you think the next few years holds? Are there any approaches that you make you optimistic? I'll just float one thing out there. I mean, one thing that strikes me is that it seems to me that one of the implications of your work is that the effort to verify human participants in a network in the kind of way that we want to is likely to become more and more resource intensive. I wonder if you agree with that as an implication, and I wonder if you if you have any thoughts about that, or if you have any thoughts about just basically where this space will go in the next few years.
Do you want to take that, Misha, first?
Yeah, I would just try to frame that in the context of Web3 development, because or like blockchain system, because if you think about blockchain protocol, the problem of that kind of system, you need to have a kind of coordination and like a global agreement of all validators about who are the validators in the network, right? So it's quite problematic, like, because the only primitives in crypto space we have is the tokens, that is essentially comes down to the proof of stake, right, systems. And we now have these experiments with proof of personhood, which is a kind of another primitive that also has its own flaws. And what currently Adina is experimenting, is running experiment with like a combination of those two, right? But it's about like the Web3 space and about global coordination. Another alternative is kind of having like more local things, right? And like a community-based things. And maybe Puja, you can add this on that regards here.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your first question, I think in terms of like the computational resources required to run these global systems, like one thing that's underappreciated and a point that we made at the end of the paper is if you have a global protocol and everything is built on this global protocol and like making sure that people aren't trading their accounts or even renting their time, like that requires actually global enforcement, right? Which is surveillance. And so the more, and it's like an intuition I have, I'm sure there's like a proof around somewhere, but there's probably some like inverse square law that the more surface area you try to cover and enforce something, it actually is the more proportionally more surveillance that's required. So it's not linearly more surveillance, but it's increasing returns of surveillance. And nobody wants that, right? Like nobody, like nation states don't want to give power to, some global protocol that needs, in turn, massive surveillance powers to enforce it. So I think probably in terms of the trajectory of where things are going, I'm not so worried about these kind of global protocols and succeeding. I think probably like Google and Facebook will have their own verification methods, and the vertical integration with AI, the AI stack will happen there. And so like WorldCoin and Sam Altman, they're doing their own vertical integration play, right? But their entry point is OpenAI and WorldCoin, right? But that's a much thinner entry point than say Facebook or Google that already has all of this. So I think it's probably going to be more like oligopolistic. And so I'm not like too worried. But I also think to make these systems work better, we have to focus on making things that are like useful for groups and communities and helping them cooperate with other communities and do things that are relevant for them. And I just don't think the stuff, like I think Web3 is a very interesting experimental ground for these things. And there's a lot of, and especially in privacy preserving, I would say like contextual integrity preserving technologies. And because there's so much money at stake, it's like a natural bounty system to stress test. Does this thing actually leak data or it doesn't? And so I think that's like a very, like it's useful in that sense. But ultimately, like the identity problem is, in my personal opinion, is not something that is going to be solved by like a universal system. It's being something more like a standard, right? And there are people who've done lots of work on standards and maybe different expressions of different standards. We'll see if they converge or if they don't. But ultimately, the power will rest with people when they decide to kind of form communities and govern, through common partial ownership, their resources and coordinate with others. And that's kind of like where all of my focus is, and finding things that are useful for groups, and groups expressing themselves as a group in the first place. If you don't do that, it doesn't really work.
Super. Thank you. Jack.
Yeah, I don't know if we're at time or anything, but one question I had that sort of relates to Matt's closing question around where you think this might be going. I feel like one interesting implication of this paper where you're sort of saying how humans can act like bots, and that it's not just simply about distinguishing humans from bots. I'm curious what you think of the flip side, where in some cases bots could act like humans, in the sense that there could be more legitimate bots because they too might have differentiated affiliations or something that are maybe more collective opinions, but are still worthy of respect or something. that they're kind of an independent voice. And if you think that might be part of the, the paradigm here that you're articulating.
Let me just jump in quickly to say that we're at the hour, so if anyone needs to go, completely understood. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be hanging out here for another 15 minutes or so for more questions if anyone would like to stick around.
I think that's right, Jack. It's not the case that we don't like bots, it's that we don't like being fooled by them, right? Like, and this kind of gets more into the assistive aspects of technology. And when there's, you can imagine a future where communities and groups like have an AI that represents, that kind of does a good job of at least articulating what the group wants, and can go around negotiating with other AIs that represent other groups and help facilitate basic like cooperation or even matchmaking, right? It's kind of actually the two-sided marketplace. And that's great, right? If you can facilitate cooperation amongst people and the fulfillment of wants and needs. I think the thing that, and then of course, like you can imagine, imagine there's like, a network of chess groups or volleyball groups, and each team has like their bot that negotiates like when do we play the next game and with who, right? And then you can imagine like maybe there's another bot that actually kind of represents the broader interests of this chess community or volleyball community, and like negotiates and tries to, get resources for more funding, with the football network of football team bots, right? And then this actually can make provisioning much richer and more plural, but ultimately they're governed by the communities and individuals that generate them and give them permissions to represent their interests and access rights to the information that enables them to do that in limited ways. So yeah, I think you're right. Like the kind of what the flip side and the kind of reversal is to actually enable bots to better represent human interests and group interests, but also be governed. I think the qualification is like be governed by them rather than govern them, right? I don't know if that answers your question.
It also strikes me, Jack, that I mean, I think there's a fairly deep question that you're pointing towards, which is like what would it mean for bots to be able to provide that kind of information, right? Information that we care that much about. Why would we care so much about that information, right? Is it, and Paula, you mentioned a while ago this idea of sort of diversity of information, which I think is that's a really interesting sort of framework through which to look at this. In other words, like one reason why you might think we care about information coming from genuine thinking, feeling humans is that information is a source of novelty or something, right? Or is adding to the diversity of our information ecosystem. And you might imagine bots might be able to do that too in some way, but how, right? I mean, would that mean that bots are providing information that pertains to other humans? Do these things need to loop back onto each other in some way? I don't have any idea the answer, but these are like very, very, very big questions, which I think are implicated by this work.
Let me also like add this something like about this question. Actually, Jack, your question is actually it's a question about agency, right? And like we have a problem like of people who are not agentic enough, right? I mean these puppets, and if we think about the bots, like from my perspective, like, so I think the bots is more like a tool for someone's agency. I like this idea of what you just mentioned about this like community that can employ bots to represent their kind of interests, and it's like then a community becomes like a agentic, right? And the bot can represent their interests on the community level, which is really kind of interesting idea. But I wouldn't put the agency like to the bot itself, like on its like, you know, it's not autonomous, at least at current level of AI development. And even us ourselves, we are not autonomous, right? Like we are in some contexts we are kind of bots, in some contexts we are more like agentic.
Yeah, so that's a point. So I feel like the paper, the more interesting part of the paper were all the footnotes, and I regret that when that happens. But that did happen, and we wrote a lot about agency actually there. And I think, so as Misha just said, like in some contexts, we're more kind of quote unquote agentic than in others, right? So my dad is very agentic in the context of medicine, right? But when in the context of Web3, he's a puppet. He's my puppet, right? Or in technology, and vice versa, right? And it's actually, when we want to kind of promote agency amongst people, what we actually are really trying to do is say they have enough sources of diverse information. What we mean by diverse is non-correlated information. And that information is grounded in truth. Like that's like a big thing, right? Just having, you know, believing the earth is flat and 5G towers and are going to like give you cancer and all these things, like that's diverse sources of information, but actually probably really clustered and not really grounded in scientific truth, right? So we want like agency is like a combination of both intersectionality and participation in information channels or groups that aren't really talking, that you're talking to, but they're not really talking to each other, plus like some element of that being grounded in truth. And you can think about bots and like nested bots, like just as humans are nested and cooperative, and the richness of and complexity of human cooperation and cooperative networks, like we should also kind of expect the same thing with AIs and AI agents. And there's going to be degrees in which like this is just a bot that's representing like forget like a narrow person, but a person that is nested in many narrow communities with a bunch of clustered opinions where, you know, they tend to believe, they believe this and therefore they tend to believe that and tend to believe that. And there's some amount of like predictability about what they think. Versus bots that are actually like, say, have, you know, diverse inputs from bots, which themselves have very diverse inputs. And so there's going to be a spectrum of quote unquote agency, not just with humans, but also with bots, and recognizing that, you know, and not in a panopticon way, but enabling people within their context to recognize what is kind of more different from them, but also high credibility and grounded in truth versus what's not, and letting them kind of slowly build bridges, you know, through their social network and across greater distance, I think is the ideal in the future of plural technology. But we'll see if we actually get there. I think we will get there. I have to be an optimist. We will get there.
Quite optimistic ending.
There's a lot more to discuss, but that might be a great place to close unless others have burning questions, we can end there. All right. Thank you all so much for joining, and thanks especially to Paula, Misha, and Puja for this terrific work and for sharing it with us today. This was fantastic. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.